Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Megan Whitfield, the Director of External Relations for the library. We're excited to welcome you, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank you for your support of the university and of the library. I would first like to acknowledge the history of the land that we are situated on to recognize the Indigenous peoples whose existence and struggles have been largely absent from the Canadian consciousness for hundreds of years, and to collectively reflect on our role in repairing our nation's relationship with the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within our Office of Indigenous Relations. I also have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share with you quickly before we begin. We'll have the question and answer function open for the duration of the presentation, so please feel free to type in your question at any time. You can do so by clicking the small icon question mark in the top right-hand corner of your screen. This will open the Q&A function, and Jessica will answer the questions at the end of her presentation. The event is being recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording by clicking on the same link that you used to join. I'd like to now introduce our university librarian, Beth Namachavaya, to bring a few words of welcome. Beth, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to everyone who has joined us today. As Megan noted, my name is Beth Namachavaya. I'm the university librarian here at the University of Waterloo Library. And we're going to see a very special, view into the university library special collections and archives. Jessica Blackwell is going to give us a guided tour of those materials. One of the things I would like to mention that is particularly a point of pride for the library is the fact that in a university setting where understandably almost everything we do is focused on the future and really, preparing students for the best careers and futures that they could reach, and preparing ourselves with the kind of scholarly information that is really important for learning and for research. We're so excited to be a part of this atmosphere here at Waterloo, and we also know that it is a responsibility of a research library to ensure that we provide access to and that we steward information and scholarship that also helps us remember where we've come from. And that's what I think is an important part of framing the important work that is done in our special collections and archives department. So with that, I just want to say thank you for supporting this work. It is a part of the future because it's an important part of our history and our stories about the past. So thank you, and I'd like to just say let's enjoy the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Beth. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Jessica Blackwell. Jessica holds an MLIS from Western University and has been with Special Collections and Archives since 2012. Prior to coming to Waterloo, Jessica worked in public libraries, museums, and heritage sites. She is passionate about connecting students with the past through the means of material culture. I'll now hand it over to you, Jessica.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Hi again. So thank you so much for joining me here today. I apologize for being muted. I have 10 items here that I'd like to show you today. They aren't in any sort of particular order in terms of 1 through 10 in terms of what I think is the best items. But they are 10 items that I think are really interesting and really showcase the diversity in our collections as well. So I'm just going to start here. Oh, no. Can I be seen again? Okay, sorry about that. Back to working. All right, so apologies for all of that. I'm going to start here with a digital surrogate of an item. So this item I'm not showing in person because its condition is on very, very fragile, quite thin onion skin paper, and also its size. It's a very large map, so it's sort of impractical for me to show. But I am going to show you a sort of a scan of a part of it. So hopefully everybody can see this map. So as Megan discussed at the beginning when she opened her introduction, she did a land acknowledgement and talked a little bit about the lands that the University of Waterloo is situated on. So we are situated here on the Haldimand Tract, and the Haldimand Tract is the lands on 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, and that ranges from the north in Dundalk to the south in Port Maitland, roughly contemporary communities to where that tract was originally designated. The original lands here in the Dish with the One Spoon territory were home to the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Mississauga, Attawandaron, and Haudenosaunee nations. And today we still see a number of those nations living in this community. So the original Haldimand Tract was actually 950,000 acres that was granted to the Ganyengehagas people, or the Mohawk Nation. And this land was actually purchased from the Mississauga Iganigi or Mississauga the Credit people by the British, and it was granted to the Mohawk Nation as a thank you for helping to support the British during the Revolutionary War. So the lands that were originally donated, or sorry, not donated, given to the Mohawk Nation are shown here roughly in this map, and this map is from 1794. The Haldimand Tract was originally given to the Mohawk Nation in 1784. So this gives you a pretty good idea of what the lands looked like and the communities that were living in this area right around the time that this happened. We start seeing the first non-Indigenous settlers and colonists in 1798, so just after this map was created. You can see on this map that we have communities including Onondaga, Cayuga, Mohawk, and Delaware. Oh, sorry, I don't know how I did that. And then you can also see roughly where Kitchener-Waterloo region and the university would be today. So the Haldimand Tract lands that were originally given to, they were originally granted to the Haudenosaunee is now approximately 48,000 acres of what the original land grant was, and much of this land is now developed by settlers. So that's my first item I wanted to share with you today. I think it speaks really well to where the university is situated, what we're hoping to do with indigenizing our collections and our research and teaching practices here, and also a little bit of the history of the region that is not necessarily related to settler stories. I'm going to just close this one and go back to my video feed, hopefully. Okay. All right, again back. All right, so my second item actually relates to the history of the university itself. So besides our collecting areas in what we call literary and historical collections, so that's everything from local history, spiritualism and theosophy, architecture, urban planning, women's studies, a whole variety of areas. We also have materials relating to the history of the University of Waterloo. So everything from its establishment to current day, and then also departments, people that were associated with the university, and a lot of the really incredible research and work that has come out of here. So the second item I have is this one. So it doesn't maybe look that interesting from the outside, as you can probably see. It's just a physical textual document. But this is WAT4, which is the Waterloo Fortran, sorry, I'm looking for the portmanteau for that. the WAT4 Fortran compiler for the IBM 360 that was written in 1968. So this is from the papers of Don Cowan. If you're familiar with the university, I'm sure you are familiar with Don Cowan's name and his legacy here. As a professor emeritus, Don was heavily involved in the early years in the computer science programs and in even getting a computer here at the university. So this particular document, this is not the first WAT4 compiler that was written, but this one was created by Don Cowan, as you can probably see here on the title page. And then this one also has really incredible original notes by Don Cowan correcting or making changes to the document itself, as well as, you'll be able to see here in just a sec, these pasted in, let me see, which talk about how the program or the code works. So I am not a computer scientist, so I apologize if this is a very layman's sort of description of the material, because I'm a layman, so it will be. But as I understand it, a compiler is a computer program that translates an original sort of written source code into a code of a different language that can be understood by the computer. So this allowed users to isolate and correct programming errors, which from my reading I understand were quite sometimes extensive in some of the early computers, which could be difficult for students and faculty to use because when you were running your calculations, there were a lot of errors that were coming up. So the WAT4 project, although started here at the university, became an absolutely global phenomenon. The Fortran language was created by IBM. It's original, one of the earliest, I think, or earlier, maybe earliest computer programming language. And the university used this to help fix problems in the IBM computers. And the material is actually distributed globally. At one point, there were 40 different countries in 1 year that were requesting these materials so that they could use their IBM computers more easily as well. It became sort of a semi-business within the university, so where initially these were given out for free, they started charging a nominal fee, which didn't stop people from acquiring the materials. And I believe that Don Cowan recounts in a story that 1 year they made $2 million just selling these WAT4 compilers to people who needed them across the globe. It also really helped in terms of making computers easier for students to work with and use. It really helped to develop the computer programming and computer science programs and faculties here at the university. I'm going to put that one aside. So my next item is very, very different. From very modern computers to very early technological processes. This is a single excised leaf. Excised means sort of cut out from a book of hours. So I'm going to show you it here. I'm going to show you both sides. Here's the one page, and then here's the other. We often see excised leaves like this come up for sale for a number of reasons. Books were often broken often in the 19th century by unscrupulous dealers and sellers who wanted to sell the individual pages as art items as opposed to an entire book together as a monograph intended to be read. So these are collected often more for their intrinsic material and artistic value than they are for the content that's actually written on the pages. So in this particular case, this item dates from the 1460s and is likely from France, likely from Paris. It is written in Latin, not in French. The Latin from this era can be a little bit difficult to read and recognize because there's a number of shorthands used, and the font that's used can also be sort of difficult to read. So I'm going to show you this page again. You can see a little bit of the Latin there. I don't know how good anybody's Latin is. I'm probably better than mine, which is not very good at all. So you can imagine if you were writing that out by hand, you would want to use as many short forms and probably as small of a font as possible to save yourself some time and some effort. And this is handwritten. This is a manuscript document, manuscript being handwritten as opposed to typescript being typed. It was likely created by a scribe who worked in a religious order, and this probably would have been what they did for a living as a career. They would have written out manuscript religious documents. So Book of Hours is a small devotional that is used to pray the canonical hours. So when I'm talking about the canonical hours, those are the prayer times that are set through the day. And a lot of the all the Abrahamic religions have these, and a lot of other religions as well. In the Christian or Catholic context, these would be things like praying vespers, matins, vigil, etc. So Books of Hours are typically abbreviated breviaries that would have been used by lay people. So a breviary would have been used in a monastery to pray the canonical hours, and this would have been a much more time-consuming and devoted process because that's what you had devoted your life to, living in a monastery. So this is for lay people who wanted to bring in some of that style of devotion into their daily life. So that's what a Book of Hours would have been. It also explains the size of it. It's something that would have been a more of a personal object than if we imagine sort of early medieval illuminated manuscripts, which are quite large, right, if we think about them. So Books of Hours were typically commissioned specifically by the person who wanted one. So that can actually tell us a lot about society at the time because there may have been particular emphasis on certain saints or certain feast days that would have been popular or important in that time or in that community that they were from. We can also tell a lot about what was important in the Book of Hours by looking at the colors that are used. So if you see here, the beginning of this line of text is red versus the rest of the text below it, until we get to the next section of red, is black. This is what we call rubrication. So rubrication is when a bit of text is written in red. It comes from excuse me. It comes from the Latin rubrica, which means red ochre. This is typically to show us something that's important in the text. So it might be a heading or the beginning of a new passage that they want to sort of iterate, here begins this, here begins this. It can also be used to show us important names in a text as well. So for instance, the name of a saint or the name of Jesus might be written in red to indicate that it's important as well. And then it can also be used to indicate where the original creator or the person who commissioned the text found value also. So that can be really interesting to understand as well. So this particular page, the beginning of it at least, that I was able to read and translate, appears to be a text that would have been said at First Vespers. It's an antiphon, which is a type of chant, so words set to sort of a chant type music. And it speaks about the feast of St. John the Evangelist on December 27th. So that's what the first section says there, is about St. John. So the rest of it I was having trouble translating, but I think that we can reasonably assume it carries on with the text that we would see in a typical breviary or a typical Book of Hours from that period. All right. So our next item, we're going to move back into the 20th century. Here. So this is a very small diary that was kept by someone named Frederick Arthur Edmonds. Frederick Arthur Edmonds was born in Scotland in 1884, and he originally immigrated to Canada to move to Guelph to be an oboe player in the Guelph Symphony Orchestra. While he was living in Canada, he enlisted in the First World War. Excuse me, he enlisted in the 11th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. And he was in the trench from April 1915 to April 1917. So he spent 2 years on the front lines, and primarily in France and Belgium. And he kept a pocket diary documenting almost every single day of that 2-year period. So it's a really incredible portal into a personal lived experience of the First World War and what it was like to actually be in the trenches and experiencing that. There's one page in this diary that I think is extremely powerful and moving, and I think you'll agree with me when I read it to you. I'm going to show you it, and then I will read the translation or the transcription as well. This is the page here, just a little tiny page. So this was written on June 12, 1916, and in it he writes, "Still in billet, but all ready to go to the line tonight for an assault on the German position. The attack is to be launched by the glorious 1st Canadian Division at 1:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. P.S. If this is to be be my last entry. Please forward this little book to Mother. So it's a really incredibly powerful entry showing someone that, knew that this could possibly be their last moments and what they would like to say to their family and to record about that. And the bravery as well that it shows to go in full well knowing that you might not come out. So Frederick Arthur Edmonds did survive the battle, which is the Battle of Montreal. It was a multiple-day battle, and ultimately the Canadians repelled the German troops and were able to keep the line. So Edmonds, after April 1917, he was essentially invalided. So just before the Battle of Vimy Ridge, he ended up actually contracting influenza, or what was at the time believed to be influenza, according to his medical chart. And he spent 5 weeks in a hospital in France recuperating. And then from that point, he was also recorded as having something that we often see in military medical records as BDH, which is a type of heart defect. So they believed at the time that it was a type of heart problem that was brought upon by stress or an anxiety. And you can imagine, obviously, being in the front lines would provide a lot of stress and anxiety. So he ultimately never ended up going back to the front lines to fight. And in February of 1918, he received a special case discharge. So he was considered to be medically unfit for service anymore because of this heart problem. And I think what we would understand today as being shell shock as well. So it's indicated that he had what they called a nervous disposition in his medical records. So he ended up actually moving back to Ontario. He settled in Waterloo, where he married, and he lived here until 1962 and carried on with his life as an oboe player. So I think that's a really interesting little one there of a local person. So my next item is more of a physical object. And this might be a bit of a surprise because I think for most people when you think about archives, well, probably if you read like the Da Vinci Code or anything like that, when you think about archives, you think about really interesting mysteries and hidden things, and also probably like dusty books. That's what we always hear when we're listening to books, and makes all of us archivists angry. Nothing is dusty. But this is actually an artifact, which is typically more associated with museums. So artifacts aren't something that we necessarily actively collect here, but sometimes they come with collections and they help to show us the story or the history of a collection or a theme or a period in history as well. So this item is a spirit trumpet. I'm going to extend it here and then move back a little bit so you can get a sense of the size of it. So this is from the Mains Pincock family collection. And the Mains Pincock family lived in St. Catharines. And they were involved in the spiritualism movement and in hosting seances in their home and with their family. So a spirit trumpet would have been used during a seance by a direct voice medium for spirits to speak through. It would help to amplify the spirits' voices. And there is also cases reported of apports from the French, which were described as objects that would appear inside the trumpet. And there was reports of seances where objects would appear inside the trumpet and they would sort of pour out the end, and they would be these objects that were physically too large to have fit inside a trumpet. So during these seances, people believed that the trumpet would move around, it might interact with people, with sitters at the seance, perhaps tap them or come and speak something directly to them, and that they would be able to hear spirits' voices through it as well. Oftentimes, spirit trumpets were painted or ringed with a radium paint so that they would be visible in the dark and easier to see for sitters at the seance. You can see a little bit of evidence of this on ours, actually. It's kind of hard to tell. But right here on the rim, there's a bit of discoloration that someone has pointed out, a previous researcher, as likely being remnants of that paint, which maybe I shouldn't touch, but sure, it's fine now. So spirit trumpets are very interesting. They were actually popularized by a person who lived in, popularized by Jonathan Coons, who lived in Ohio. He had a message from spirits that told him to create this sort of spirit house that he created on his property. It was a log house where he would host people for seances. And it's believed that the spirit trumpet itself was actually created by his son, Nahum, who would be involved in the seances as well. And the spirit house was filled with different instruments that spirits could use to communicate with people, with sitters at the seances. This particular spirit trumpet was likely owned by William Carthuser, who was a popular medium who was involved or was known to the Maine's Pincock Circle. They were friends and they would sit in seances together as well. And it likely dates from the 20s to the 30s. We see some really interesting ads for spirit trumpets and some of the materials in our collections as well. Originally, they were often homemade from cardboard or from tin, metal, and then ultimately there came to be an actual industry of spirit trumpets to supply to spiritualists that were typically metal as well, and then with the paint on them. A really interesting sort of, I think, quote about the importance of spirit trumpets for people in the spiritualist movement is from Anna Louisa Fletcher, who's a spiritualist, and she said, "What comes through the trumpet is the evidence on which to pin our faith." Okay, so my next item is actually a video, so I'm going to attempt to do that now. That's a glimpse of my daughter there. All right. I'm just going to let it play. It's not very long, and then I'll speak a bit about it. So that video is one of the earliest ones in our collections. It dates from the 1920s, and it shows the exterior and the workers at the our Forbes Company woolen mill in Hesler, which is now Cambridge. So Cambridge was an absolute hotbed of textile industry in the region, and also within the entire British Empire. So the Forbes mill was originally built in 1864 and was purchased by Robert Forbes in 1874. He moved from Scotland with his sons, and they purchased the mill and began running it from Randall Farr and Company. It's on Queen Street in Hesler, right along the river, sort of between the train tracks and the river, to give you a sense of its locality if you're familiar with Hesler or Cambridge region at all. In 1888, the mill was incorporated. It grew larger and larger and larger. They tore down some of the original buildings to build modern, larger buildings because they were doing such a large business. And ultimately, it actually became the largest textile mill in the entire British Commonwealth. So a very, very large, important company in the Hesler region. It was purchased by Dominion Woolens and Worsteds, which continued on being a very important textile company. And then Silknet was in there as well after that. So the mill has over 100 years of continuous use in the textile industry. The mill is still there for the most part. The majority of it was burnt down in 1995, excepting sort of 2 buildings along that area. But it's currently being redeveloped, and you can actually rent it if you're interested in the space right now. In a historic mill, there is space for rent in there, and it's being redeveloped into a mixed-use building, so condos, commercial, that sort of thing. It's a really important video for a number of reasons. One, it shows women in the labor field in the 1920s, so it gives us a sense of what kind of work women were doing at that time. You also probably noted that some of the people that were coming out of the factory looked as though they were perhaps under the age of 18, so it also gives us a sense of sort of child labor at that time. Child labor in textile mills was relatively common because working on those large looms, as you probably saw in the video, they needed sort of smaller bodies and hands to be able to get in there and do some of the finer work. It also shows us the development of Cambridge. A number of those houses were likely built by industries in the region, the textile industry, for employees. This was very common at the time and happened in Kitchener-Waterloo as well. And it also talks a little bit about some of the processes that we have to go through here at the archives to make these materials available to the public. So this particular item is a reel-to-reel. It's a reel film. It's not a VHS or Betamax or a DVD or an MP4 or anything like that when it originally came to us. It's a physical film reel, and we had to have this digitized. So this sort of work is something that we cannot do in-house. We don't have the abilities to do so. We don't have, a reel player and a Betamax player and a VHS player and all of the different obsolete technologies that you would need to do this. So we actually send this material out to a company, which we pay for, and then they send us back the material along with MP4 files. So it's a big process. It's something that we are constantly doing because we are constantly being donated really incredible materials that are perhaps visual or are audio that we just don't have the access to, unfortunately, because of their format. So that's an example of something that we've been doing to work on that and to make it available. So that video we've actually made available on our Waterloo Digital Library, which is where we have digitized versions of textual, visual, audio, and moving picture materials. And it's also up on our YouTube channel, the University's Library's YouTube channel. And it's been used quite a bit, actually, by historical organizations in Hesler, including one about the history of the mill and the Dominion Woolens and Worsteds business itself. All right, so the next thing I'm going to show you is sort of a 2-for-1 because I couldn't decide between which image. They're similar. They show a similar thing, so that's why. So these are both photographs that come from the Seagram collection. You may be familiar with Seagram's from the alcohol. So Seagram's was a business that was founded here in Waterloo initially, and they did produce liquors here in Waterloo. The building in the original factory is still standing, but it's now been repurposed into condos and other types of things there. Seagram's also had a dry goods store originally when the company was founded. That was on King Street, the east side of King Street at Herb in Uptown Waterloo. And so these are some images that were donated as part of the Seagram collection that show what the region was like at that time that the original dry goods store existed. So this first one here, I'll show you. a little difficult to see because it's quite faint now. It's worn out a little bit. But this is an image of people standing on the east side of King Street, standing in front of what was at the time the Bowman Hotel, and is now the Waterloo Hotel. You can see the carriage post or hitching post that they're standing next to that has that on it. And this photo is from likely between 1864 and 1875. So it's one of our earliest images that shows what Waterloo looked like at the time. And it gives you a really good sense of how the city was growing based on the number of businesses and the different types of businesses that were in the city. So you can see there's a druggist, there's a pharmacy, there's a tailor, there's a business that sells pots and pans, and they have a really wonderful sign with a big pot on it, which I think is something we might think of as more of a contemporary thing to do, maybe not from the 1860s, but it's quite wonderful. And in the same vein, we also have this photograph. So this is King Street North, south of Erb, so same area. And this you can see shows a woman crossing the street to the other side of the street at the time, where the Seagram dry goods store was. Now this photograph is a little bit later, likely from 1895 to 1905. So it also gives us the opportunity to look at the development of Waterloo in that period. It was a period of massive growth in the region. And new industry coming in as well. And it gives us a good sense as well of sort of the society and the culture at the time. Also, you know, of course, we've got dirt roads here, very different from today. There was an early railway that, you know, if you were reading the news when they were doing the LRT, you probably saw they dug up the original train tracks from and replacing the new train tracks in. And you can see a little bit where they've made sort of pedestrian access a little bit easier, where they've sort of paved a bit down into the road so that you can cross the street there. So my next item is very, very different. Moving from early history to Waterloo to more early history of civilization. Very small. This is a coin from our Pike coin collection. So Edgar William Pike was a gentleman who lived in Toronto. He was born in 1891. He became a classics teacher in a high school, and he was passionate about his students having access to experiential learning and to materials that made the past and history come alive to them. As such, he was an avid collector of historic coins and antiquarian coins. This is one of the items from his collection. It's quite small. It's a little tiny coin. You can sort of see that. So it's an irregular shape, as you can probably see. On the part that I showed you, it's a little hard to tell because it is from 560 BCE, so it's about 2,500 years old. So it's had a bit of a history and a life of rubbing on it. But on the one side, there's the face of a bull facing the face and hindquarters of a lion. And on the reverse, so an obverse has the bull and the lion. And on the reverse, we have incused squares. So they're sort of punched in little squares. So this is actually one of the first coins that was sort of ever made in terms of society. So coin production really started in Lydia, which is now Western Turkey, the Kingdom of Lydia in Western Turkey, in the 7th century BCE. So just a little bit before this one was created, about 100 years before this one was created. So Lydian coins are some of the oldest coins that we have. And it also was the beginning of the concept of coinage, so being able to trade these things for goods or services as opposed to a barter system. And it spread into the Hellenistic world, and then from there across Western Europe and elsewhere. Original coins were made out of electrum. Electrum is an alloy of largely gold and silver, a little bit of copper, and some other trace materials or metals that's naturally occurring. They were made out of electrum because electrum is found in alluvial deposits in the river that actually runs through Sardis, which is the capital of Lydia. So a really common metal for people to have access to at the time. They switched to being made primarily out of silver and gold in Lydia after this, and the one that I just showed you now is made out of silver. The majority of the coins in the collection that we have are silver or bronze. There's one gold one and one electrum one as well. It was produced during the reign of Croesus, and Croesus is extremely important in terms of the history of numismatics and coin production. He actually standardized the purity of coins. He was extremely, extremely wealthy. So the reason why it's sort of a regular shape, today we're used to looking at, quarters are a certain size and dimes are a certain size and pennies were a certain size when they existed in Canada, is because the shape didn't matter. It was all about weight. So it was a certain weight of silver, and these coins would have been standardized to be that exact weight, and so you would have known that you were paying the right amount of money or someone was giving you the right amount of money based on the weight of the coin as opposed to the shape or the size or the imprint on the coin. You may have heard of Croesus before with the saying, like, richer than Croesus. It's sort of maybe a semi-popular saying for someone who's extremely wealthy. And this is part of the reason why with the standardization of the monetary system. So the pipe collection is really important for a number of reasons. Obviously, just from a purely aesthetic viewpoint, it's incredible to look at these ancient coins. They're beautiful looking, they have really interesting iconography on them, but it's also really important from the viewpoint of teaching students. So this gives students an opportunity to connect with history in a really physical and material way, to hold a coin that's 2,500 years old and imagine what people were spending it on in Lydia in 560 BCE, or how many people's lives and hands it may have touched throughout that time, is a really credible experience for students. It also leads into some amazing opportunities and projects for experiential learning. So for instance, this semester, I am working with a professor in the classics faculty who has allowed 2 of his students who are very interested in numismatics to do a unique assignment. So instead of doing one of the assignments built into the course, they're actually each researching a subset of these coins for us to provide more information for us, for our catalog, and to write about for their course. So it's really wonderful. And hopefully, if everything goes well, we'll be able to actually hire those students in January to carry on with this project as contract staff and to provide us with more details on the coins than we would maybe have the time or the expertise to do ourselves. So the students are working with coin catalogs that have been either purchased by the faculty, or we have interlibrary loan from other libraries across Canada, and they come in a few times a week for a few hours a day to work with the materials. And that is what I love about my job, is connecting students coming in and saying, wow, this is super cool, this is a 2,500-year-old coin, because it is. All right, I have 2 items. I'm going to talk faster. Well, actually, I want to talk faster because I probably can't, but I'm going to try to go a little faster. My next item is from the Parents Information Bureau. So the Parents Information Bureau was founded in the 1930s in Kitchener by A.R. Kaufman. A.R. Kaufman was a local industrialist who was very interested in family planning and conception and birth control. Kaufman is a very controversial figure. A lot of the work that he did and a lot of the services that he provided were incredible for people to have the opportunity to access free or low-cost birth control materials at a time when this was largely either, in some cases, illegal or inaccessible to them. However, his belief in birth control was heavily rooted in eugenics. He started being interested in it during the Depression because he noted that a number of the workers at his factory that were more temporary workers or were not making as much money were struggling more with large families. And so he believed that they should not have as many children as opposed to maybe paying them more money. But as part of the Parents Information Bureau, he also started the Toronto Birth Control Clinic. So this was founded in 1933. It only ran for 5 years until 1938. It was run by a nursing supervisor, and they also had 3 doctors and 1 social worker on staff. In that 5-year period, about 10,000 women were seen at the Toronto Birth Control Clinic, and it ultimately closed because of the costing of running it and the fact that the municipality and the city wasn't interested in supporting the clinic in any way. So what I have is actually a scrapbook that was likely created by A.R. Kaufman's daughter, but it has no signature, so that's sort of a guess of an attribution. But it's a really wonderful item. It's a little scrapbook that has these sort of witty and sarcastic and satirical writings about the Toronto Birth Control Clinic and the process that they were going through with the City of Toronto not wanting to, or not being willing to sort of support the clinic. And it's pasted in images from a book of Pinocchio, the story of Pinocchio. And so they've used these images along with this typewritten text to make really poignant sort of statements about the process at the time. It's really interesting because it's quite a subversion of the sort of Victorian genre of scrapbook making, which was a very sort of genteel women's pastime. So to take that style of pastime or of artistic activity and to make it into this very satirical, very political, very pointed kind of scrapbook of a really important women's sexual health topic is very interesting. So this one, for instance, shows the person in the middle, which is described as me in this, with two figures on either side, which are described as the doctors or the medicines and the Pope. And the note at the bottom reads, birth control has a hard time between the Church of Rome and the medical profession with their self-interest. So just to give you an example of some of the items that are in there. Okay, my last thing, last but not least by any means. This is actually probably often given as our, I guess, communally our favorite item in the collection as the department for a number of reasons. It's something that we show pretty much everybody who comes in because it's so wonderful. And this is an edition of Euclid's Elements of Geometry. You can see here's the cover of the book. So this was printed in 1570. It is the first English translation of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, and it was translated from the original Greek as opposed to the more common Latin version by Sir Henry Billingsley. So Henry Billingsley was the Lord Mayor of London. He was also a haberdasher, and he, in his spare time, I suppose, did this really quite extensive translation into English. So about half of the book is the translation itself, and about half is actually notes by Billingsley to help make the text clearer. It's really a who's who of people that were living and working in the Reformation era in England in the 1570s. The preface is by John Dee, who you might be familiar with the name of. He was advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. He was a well-known alchemist and occultist and scientist and astronomer and sort of everything at the time that went along with that. And he writes about the importance of mathematics and numbers as being sort of a building block for everything else that we understand about the universe. It was printed by John Day. John Day was the printer of the English Reformation period. He had the monopolies on all of the most prominent and popular books of the time, including the whole book of Psalms, which was the best-selling book of the period. He was so sort of passionate, will we say, about printing that his son actually printed some illegal copies of one of his works, and he actually went and destroyed his son's printing press. So he was very serious about his monopolies on printing at the time. The thing that makes this book also very, very special is this really incredible pedagogical aid that has these pop-ups that show geometric solids. I'm just going to turn to the one page here. Hopefully we can see that okay. I'm just going to hold it up really nice and high. Need 3 arms here. So these are these wonderful pop-ups. These are original to the book. They were part of the original design. And they allow us to, instead of just sort of imagining what a geometric shape might look like, we can actually build it with these aids. So really helpful if you're like me and you read this and it says, you know, angle A is 97 degrees and angle B is 52 degrees, and you can't possibly imagine what that might look like in your head. This is an incredible pedagogical aid. It's not the very first time that we see pop-ups in a book, but it is a very early example of pop-ups, and has come to be sort of well known as a really important version of Euclid's Elements of Geometry because of that time. The other thing that's really wonderful about this book is that a few years ago we had some really extensive conservation work done on it. So we sent it for conservation in London, Ontario, to our conservator, because it's something that we use so frequently and it's so well loved. It has suffered a little bit from a lot of love over the years. So if you look here, you can see where the light colored paper is. That's where new paper has actually been put on from the edges fraying just from years and years and years of use of the papers, right? Imagine 500 odd years, 550 years of people thumbing through a book. It's going to start to wear down over time. So Jen, our conservator, spent about a year actually working on this book, fixing almost every single page, tightening up the binding, cleaning up things that were damaged inside, and it's now hopefully good to go for another 550 years. All right, so that was my last item. I'm sorry I talked so much, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A now.
Thank you, Jessica. No need to apologize. That was wonderful. So please do feel free to type your questions into the question and answer function in Teams. We did have a couple of questions submitted throughout your presentation, Jessica, so I will just go ahead and ask them out loud to you. So the first is, what is the most viewed item?
That's kind of a tricky one, but I think the most viewed item is likely a photo called Roy and Beans. And it really sounds a bit like, if you're thinking about it. But it's an image from the Kitchener-Waterloo Record Collection, which is our largest photographic collection. We have about 3 million negatives in that collection. And it's a picture of a man feeding a horse an ice cream cone. It's a department favorite photo, and it's something that we use quite a bit to advertise the fact that we've been making digitized photographs available through the Waterloo Digital Library. I'm just going to show you it because it's kind of like, what? This is the photo, horse and ice cream cone, unpublished. And what makes this photo sort of so well loved, and the reason why it's so frequently looked at, is because when you hear the photo of Roy and Beans, you probably have a thought in your head about who is Roy and who is Beans, and you are wrong. So the horse is named Roy, and the man is named Beans. And we all thought that that was absolutely delightful, and so that's why it's sort of one of our favorite images of all time, and why it's one of the most looked at images in our collection. Trying to get back to the screen here. There we go.
Thank you. The next question, any special conservation problems with preserving your collections?
So one of the things that we're dealing with right now is the issues with conservation for photographic materials. The vast majority of the photographic materials in our collection are acetate plastic, so negatives, and they unfortunately go through a process that's colloquially known as vinegar syndrome, which is properly called acetate film-based degradation. So they start to produce acetic acid, which is why we call it vinegar syndrome, because they smell quite heavily like vinegar. And it's just a natural breaking down of the chemical process and the materials that were used in the film. So this can cause a lot of issues. Obviously, the smell is a concern, but it ultimately causes the negatives or the film to become very brittle. They start to shrink, and then also the emulsion can start kind of buckling and coming away from the acetate base. So this is something that can be sort of slowed down or partially remedied by keeping the materials cool. So we do have a number of industrial sort of commercial kitchen fridges that we have on site that we store negatives that we've noticed are starting to have this issue in. But it's an ongoing process of constantly testing for the vinegar syndrome. We use these little strips that can test acidity and making sure that we're always keeping on top of it. And if we ever smell vinegar, to make sure that we're getting those items into the fridge as fast as we can, because once the syndrome starts, it just sort of spirals. It speeds up and speeds up and speeds up the process of degradation.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm learning all kinds of stuff. The next question, do we or how do we prioritize what we acquire or keep in the archives?
That's a good question. It's something that we talk about in library school, and it's something that I think as you develop in the profession, you become better at. So I've been here for just over a decade now, and I think when I first started, I was really concerned about keeping everything. Like, I was so concerned that I'd throw something away and someone would want to see it at one point in time. So there's a number of factors that we use. One is looking at different types of value. So when I'm talking about values, I don't mean monetary necessarily. I'm thinking about intrinsic value of the items. I'm thinking about the research potential value of the items for our students or others who would research with our materials. And I'm thinking about the historical value of the items as well. So that's one of the ways. The other way is to rely on your institution's collections development policies. So hopefully your institution has a robust collections development policy that can help guide you in terms of what is or is not appropriate for your institution to collect. Generally, I mean, that's a little bit harder for archives in general, but we also do pass on offers of donations to other institutions if we feel that they're not appropriate for us, but that they are of value, but maybe they should be held somewhere else. And it's also just something that you get to kind of, I guess, learn with time as you're going through things and you see what is or sort of isn't used, or you start to learn more about the topic.
Thank you. The next question, how does a curator learn so amazingly much about the historical context of an item? How do you pass the research on to the next curator? I had the same thought while you were doing your presentation, Jessica. It's a lot of different things to know about. How do you ever learn so much?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's one of the things that I love about the work that I do is that I get to learn such a wide variety of subject matter. I do a ton of research. That's a huge part of my job is research for myself, for internally. And I do a lot of reading, obviously. Sometimes the materials come to us with some history and with some information, which is really valuable and useful. For instance, the Pike coin collection, because the original owner of that was someone who was interested in numismatics and who collected it. He has actually these little, I can actually show you, these little notes that come with each of the coins that have a little bit of detail about them. So that was helpful as a starting place for us. That sometimes happens. But really, yeah, it's a lot of research and reading and talking to people as well that are in the various faculties of the materials that we collect. As I mentioned, I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not a mathematician, so the way that I approach those materials is from a very different standpoint. It's really more about material culture as opposed to about the subject matter, so it's valuable as well. In terms of passing on research to the next curator, this is all documented, so we have in our database, all of these materials are listed with a description in them. So the research that I do is written down in that description. We have historical notes about the histories of the creators or the organizations that made them, that sort of thing. And then probably a lot of it is in my head as well, but it should be written down somewhere. But it's hard. We have so many. I mean, we've got over 80,000 rare books and periodicals and 10,000 linear feet of archival materials and 4 million photographs. So there's a lot of stuff to try to think about capturing.
Amazing, thank you. Well, we are coming to the end of our time. So there is one more comment in the chat. Could I just ask that the person who submitted this comment about having some items for consideration, if you could reach out to myself or Graham or Jessica specifically, I think you have at least my email and Graham's from the emails that we sent with the links to the event. If you could reach out with your question, be happy to connect with Jessica and have that discussion offline, just because we are up at the end of our time together. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a ton. I'm sure our guests did too. Thank you to all of you who attended today. Again, to everybody, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. You can also reach Jessica through the going to the Special Collections and Archives area of our website, so the library's main website. You can navigate to Special Collections and Archives and find more information there. We look forward to welcome you again in the future for another presentation. But for now, have a wonderful week. Thanks for joining us. Take care.